Good evening and welcome to our discussion on LGBT inclusion in the Episcopal Church. Today we are looking at the history of inclusion in the church, kind of some of the timeline and how it is that that we came to the position that we are at. So we'll spend this video will just be the initial part of our time together. I'll stop the recording and then we'll continue as a group with our discussion. I'll also put the link for the handout that I reference in the description of the YouTube video. So the Episcopal, I wanted to talk about LGBT inclusion as well as women's inclusion in the church at the same time because I think the two stories interweave together, and I think that they're related to each other. Our church has gone through just a drastic shift in the last 100 years, as has our nation, around a lot of different issues of social justice and inclusion. And I think it's important to recognize kind of the timeline of that and look at how long it took us to get to where we are, but also in some ways how quickly some of that happened as well. So one thing that actually Anne and I were talking about this on a call a few weeks ago about just how long it took the Episcopal Church to recognize women and allow women to speak in the church and to have voice and vote at our General Convention. So I'm going to be mentioning the convention several times during this talk. So just wanted to, for those that are new to the kind of structure of our church, we're very much based in democracy, the way that we structure our policy and decision making. And part of that, I think, was in response to just after the Revolutionary War, not wanting to be, we were called the Church of England. So as you can imagine, after the Revolutionary War, we couldn't be the Church of England anymore. And really wanted to establish ourselves as a very American church. And part of that, the founders who authored the Constitution also authored the Constitution and canons of our own church, and the structure, which very much is similar to that governmental structure. So our General Convention meets every 3 years. That's the legislative body of the Episcopal Church. It has a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. So the deputies includes lay people and priests and deacons. So, and is larger. And those representative bodies represent the different dioceses around the entire church. Each diocese elects representatives to that body, and then every single church or parish elects representatives to their diocesan body. So, so it's very much an elected denomination in terms of the way that we make decisions. And that has both been a gift to us in terms of allowing us to hear the call of the Spirit, I think, in collective decision making, but has also at times slowed us down. So women came to the 1946 General Convention and said the term laymen should include women as well. So women, we've had the right to vote in this country for 26 years at this point. It's high time the church get with it and allow women to vote as well in our representative body. They were turned down that year and again and again and again and again. And it wasn't until the year 1970 that the first female delegates were seated at the General Convention and given the ability to vote. And I think that we forget that sometimes, how long that took and what a big shift in understanding that was. So I actually printed out my handout with all of these dates here. So I just wanted to run through just a few of them to look at that. So in 1944, Florence Lee Tim Oy was the very first woman ordained in the Anglican Communion. So the Episcopal Church includes the United States, and then it also includes 15 other countries, most of them in Europe, which is all one diocese of our church in the Anglican tradition. And then our largest diocese is the Diocese of Haiti. Taiwan is also a diocese, and a few other countries. So, so the Episcopal Church General Convention gets together, but then we're also part of the Anglican Communion. So there are churches in the Anglican tradition all over the world that are connected together. And we don't have a structure like the Catholic Church with a pope that has kind of authority over everyone. But we do have the Archbishop of Canterbury as kind of the figurehead of the church. It doesn't have sort of legislative or authoritative power over the church, but is the one who invites people to be a part of the Anglican Communion and to come together for gatherings. So the Archbishop of Canterbury has this role as kind of the guardian of relationships, if you will. So I think it's a neat thing because the Anglican Communion is really an organization of relationships, but that means that maintaining those relationships, especially across significant theological differences, has been a challenge over the years. So 1944, Florence Lithium Oy is ordained in Hong Kong as the first woman ordained in our tradition. And it isn't until, of course, much later that that women are ordained in our own country. So I gave you the kind of 1946 ultimatum comes from the women who come to convention asking for seats and are denied. And in 1964, finally, the presiding bishop has had enough, is frustrated with the House of Deputies for refusing to allow women, and reprimands the House of Deputies, which is very rare in our tradition for the presiding bishop to scold the elected legislative body of the church. But the presiding bishop did do that and said, listen, you know, this is time past when this ought to happen. So it's finally in 1967 that a constitutional amendment is passed by the body, which is going to allow women to participate at the next triennial convention. So that's why it's not until 1970 that women are seated. 1974 is when the Philadelphia 11 are ordained. So this is the first 11 women in the Episcopal Church who are ordained, and they were ordained irregularly. So it was not allowed yet, but 2 retired bishops and 1 resigned bishop decided that that the church was moving too slowly. The General Convention was not responding to the way that they felt the Spirit was moving, and so they went ahead and ordained these 11 women who then, you know, become the first women ordained in the church, but then soon to follow. In 1976, the convention finally narrowly approves women's ordination. Interestingly, in 1974 is also the year that Integrity is formed, Integrity USA, which is an organization. There's a little bit of feedback here. Let me just move there. There we go. So, so in 1974, also Integrity USA is formed, and they're an organization whose goal is to have the Episcopal Church become an inclusive denomination, to have inclusivity and acceptance of LGBT people at all levels of the church. So that was 1974 is when that happens. And so in 1976, there was really a remarkable statement that came out of the church. At the similar time, there were opposite statements coming out in other denominations. So I know the Methodist Church around that same time had a statement that said that being homosexual was not in accordance with Christian faith or something like that. They've since come to a different place. But in 1976, I'm going to just read this quote. The convention affirms that homosexual persons are children of God who have full and equal claim with all other persons upon the love, acceptance, and pastoral concern and care of the church. So for the church at that time, that was a big step forward, and I think really largely due to work that was happening concurrently, both with the church becoming more open towards women's participation, but also because of the work of the Integrity organization and folks involved in that. In 1988, then, so we keep skipping forward. Actually, I'll take a pause. In 1979, we have a new prayer book that gets approved, and the new prayer book really has, I think, a profound impact on the church. So the liturgies that are used in the new prayer book, which is of course still the prayer book that we use today, the liturgies that are approved started to be used in the mid-60s in an experimental way. And the social movements of the 1960s, as well as Vatican II, had a profound impact on the shaping of those liturgies. And so what you see come out of it is a real sense that we are called as people to make connections across different denominational lines, that we are called to receive the Eucharist more often. So we go to weekly celebration of the Eucharist at that point with the 1979 book. But also the baptismal covenant comes into being for us. So previously, in order to get baptized, there was really just one promise. Do you believe in Jesus? Do you promise to follow? And that's kind of it. You say the creed, you say the Apostles' Creed, you get baptized. And with the 79 book came the baptismal covenant that we know and love today, with its 5 promises. And I think those two things, Eucharist and the 5 promises of the baptismal covenant, profoundly shaped the Episcopal Church from this point forward. So a lot of groundwork is laid in terms of social movements and coming together. But the way that we pray every single week really influences us, and really affects the way that we see each other and see the world. So the baptismal covenant, so we still baptize infants in the church, but the baptismal covenant is promises that are made on behalf of infants, or made by adults or older children on their own behalf at the time of their baptism. And then we say it all together. So it's not just the people getting baptized, but it's all of us every single time there's a baptism, and every single time there's a feast of a baptism. So, or a special feast day like All Saints Day, or the feast of Jesus's baptism. We say those words again. So at multiple times throughout the year, every Episcopalian has the opportunity to reaffirm their commitment to the core essential part of what we believe it means to be Christian. And in case those aren't just at the top of your mind, the first one is about committing to prayer and fellowship. The second is about turning from evil, repenting whenever it is that we fall into harming one another and straying from God. And returning to God and asking for forgiveness. The third one is to preach the gospel, and at all times, and when necessary, use words, as Saint Francis said. So by word and deed, to live out Jesus's teaching in our lives. And then the last two are outward focus. So we have to seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself. So clearly the golden rule there, what Jesus called us to do. And then the 5th promise was added last. So those 4 promises were present in the early drafts of the new baptismal liturgy. And the 5th promise was added, and I've heard some anecdotal evidence that it was added in light of the civil rights movement. And that is to respect the dignity of, to strive for justice and peace on the earth, and to respect the dignity of every human being. And so, I mean, if we just think about what those 5 promises mean to us, and how significant that is for the church to say, this is what it means to follow Jesus. These are the things that we promise to do. So I think that is really a part of what then helps the church to make the strides that it made after 1979 in kind of a more a quicker manner than it had been able to respond to the call of the Spirit in previous years. So in 1988, the first woman bishop is ordained in the Anglican Communion, Barbara Harris in Massachusetts. She just passed away last year, actually. And so that's another step forward in terms of women in leadership roles. And that same year in 1988, the National Episcopal AIDS Foundation was created in order to support education and ministry around the various different AIDS ministries that were already happening in the Episcopal Church at that time. And kind of bringing that front and center, that struggle and the acceptance of people, the welcoming of people into churches at a time when a lot of churches and families were rejecting people who had AIDS was definitely, I think, a profound impact on our denomination as well. And finally, in 1994, the convention changed the canons of the Episcopal Church to prevent discrimination based on sexuality in the church, which included membership as well as ordination. So officially, of course, before 1994, there were definitely LGBT people being ordained, but officially in 1994, discrimination based on that is ruled out. And then the big more recent date is in 2003. The Diocese of New Hampshire elected Gene Robinson as bishop. He was the first openly gay bishop to be elected in the Episcopal Church, and really brought to the forefront this issue. I think maybe caused us to talk about it maybe before the convention felt that it was ready to talk about it. and really push the issue and brought it forward. So the way that our structure works is if each diocese has the right to choose their own bishop. So several people put forward their names, and then the diocese gets to vote on who it is that they want. The diocese chose Gene Robinson. That is who they wanted. But because we're also, this body of churches of dioceses together, we consent on the election of other diocese bishops. So it's usually not a controversial process, and it just is sort of a rubber stamp to say that the church approves this ordination or this election. The interesting thing is, because our general convention only happens every 3 years, if that bishop is elected within 120 days of the next convention, instead of the approval just going around by writing to the diocese, it's voted on at convention. So it just happened because of when Gene Robinson's election happened, that the approval of that election was going to happen at the general convention. And something interesting happened, because the question was not whether or not we should have LGBT bishops. The question was, does the Diocese of New Hampshire have the right to choose what bishop they would like to represent them? Or does the rest of the church have the right to tell the Diocese of New Hampshire who it is that they should have? And so it was a way in which the way that the conversation was had, it was kind of a door in when, if you'll remember in 2003, that was before Proposition 8 in California. There was still just a lot of uncertainty and division in the church around this issue. And so it was a way in. And so at that convention, they approved Gene Robinson's election. Even people who theologically had trouble with it, many of them voted for his election because they felt that the Diocese of New Hampshire had the right to do so. And so it was a door into a deeper conversation, and I think a much bigger conversation than the church even really realized at the time, because of course it then caused this conversation to be brought to the front of the Anglican Communion. So the communion as a whole, which tends to be more conservative, the bulk of Anglicans in the world are in the continent of Africa. There's, I think, 60 million Anglicans in Africa. There are 2 million in the United States. So the churches, especially in Africa, but certainly in other parts of the world as well, took real issue with our steps forward, and began to question whether or not we should be allowed to remain in the Anglican Communion. And that I became a missionary of the Episcopal Church in 2006. And at that time, we were just 3 years into this conversation. It was still very much at the forefront of how are we going to hold the communion together, and is the communion something that we want to hold on to? And so I just remember that time really clearly, and this idea of what's going to get us through this disagreement is relationship, and trying to understand one another, and trying to focus on what it is that brings us together instead of what divides us. So I think that those conversations and the way in which we've maintained relationships around the world since 2003 have really helped us to grow in love and understanding of folks as well, even when we disagree. So in 2006, Catherine Jefferts Schori becomes the first female presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. In 2009, the convention finally affirms the place of same-sex couples in the church and expresses support for national laws to prevent discrimination. In 2012, the canons of the church are changed to prevent discrimination of ordination based on gender identity and expression. And then in 2015, the convention approves rights for same-sex marriages just after the Supreme Court decision happened. And most recently in 2018, before people were, priests could decline to perform marriages. And now, after this 2018 discussion, every member of the church has the right. So same-sex couples who would like to be married in the Episcopal Church have the right to be married in their home church, whether or not their local priest will do that ceremony. The rule now is that if the local priest does not want to do the ceremony, they have to provide for another priest to come and perform that ceremony in the local church. So it's interesting the way, the kind of the steps forward that the church has taken Similarly with women's ordination, at first whole dioceses were allowed to disagree and to say we're not going to ordain women. So I actually grew up in a diocese that did not ordain women all the way through the 90s. I mean, yeah, all the way into the 90s. And that was the Central Valley of California, the San Joaquin Diocese. But then it got to the point where finally they said, okay, enough is enough. We're not going to make bishops ordain women who don't want to, but those, if there are women in their diocese who are seeking ordination, they need to provide another bishop to perform that ordination. They can no longer discriminate. So similarly, that decision has come down from the General Convention. So if we look at just, it's a little bit of a whirlwind to look at just if you look at the dates to see where it is that we have come. So there's celebration in that to say we were one of the first. We weren't the first, but we were possibly the second denomination to affirm the ordination of openly LGBT folks. So we were definitely at the forefront of a conversation, which is of course now taking other denominations are having this discussion, and certainly other churches around the Anglican Communion will also be having this discussion over the next few years, as well as people need to think about and consider the movement of God in this way. But I also just want to say that it did take a long time, and there has been a lot of pain caused by the church. I grew up, as I said, not seeing women priests. Luckily, I had a cousin in Maryland who's a priest, and so I saw her performing, the duties of a priest, and I was really inspired by her as a role model as a child. But I was taught in my Episcopal school growing up, which I absolutely loved. I adored this little school that I went to, and my teachers and my classmates. But I was taught in religion class that to be attracted to someone who was the same sex was a sin. And that left a deep mark in my own heart, and something that I struggled against, even when I disagreed with that teaching, even when I came in my own mind to disagree with that teaching. There was still something that was planted really deeply, and I know that's the case for so many people. I turned 40 this year, and so this is something that has been going on in the church for decades and decades, and something that we grieve and we lament the pain that has been caused by people not seeing the full humanity and the full presence of God in one another. So it's holding both. It's saying, yes, it took us a long time to get here. We made a lot of mistakes. The church made a lot of mistakes along the way. A lot of people were hurt. And also we celebrate the fact, the brave people who told the truth and who witnessed against great odds, and against people telling them that they were sinful and they were wrong, who continued to proclaim to the church the truth that they knew of God's love for them and for all people. So I'm incredibly thankful for the people who have helped us to get where we are today. The second article that I put on the handout is one that just came out last week. I mentioned about, from the Episcopal News Service, looking at what are kind of the next steps of inclusion. We've done all the legislative things, that we need to do. All the changes in the canons have been made. But what are the cultural shifts that need to happen, continue to happen in the Episcopal Church? And what does full inclusion really look like in our hearts and in our lives? So I'm going to stop the recording there.